We rely on these incredibly heavy physical metaphors.
Yeah,
It's like
absolutely.
we talk about building platforms or laying foundations, constructing walled gardens, establishing structural pillars.
Right, which implies something fundamentally static. Like you pour the digital concrete, it sets, and you build the house on top of it.
Exactly, and you just live in it. But, I mean, if you look at the raw data flowing across the wires today, and I mean literally today, Tuesday, April 24th, 2026, you realize the concrete never actually set.
Not even close.
The foundation is moving. The gravity is shifting right beneath our feet. And we are looking at a landscape right now that is mutating so quickly that our traditional models of business and security, even basic mathematics, just can't track it.
It's dizzying, really.
It really is. So we have a massive mission for this deep dive. We've pulled a stack of 12 highly critical AI-curated technology and innovation updates straight from the Global Tech News X list. And the goal for you, the listener, is to cut through the sheer overwhelming volume of this noise and extract the actual signal.
And, what's fascinating here is that when you look at these 12 discrete stories side by side, a massive overarching pattern just sort of emerges.
Like a collision?
Exactly like a high-speed collision. On one side, you have this unprecedented technological velocity, specifically the exponential capabilities of AI and the rapidly accelerating shadow of quantum computing.
Right.
And then on the other side, you have these foundational structural shifts happening simultaneously. Historical leadership changes at legacy tech giants, massive regulatory pivots at the highest levels of the U.S. government.
We are essentially watching the speed of the future crash violently into the structures of the past. Okay, let's unpack this right now, starting with what is undeniably the biggest leadership story of the decade. We are looking at source item number 5. It's a huge one.
Yeah. After 15 years at the absolute pinnacle, Tim Cook is officially stepping down as the CEO of Apple, handing the reins over to John Ternus.
The magnitude of this transition just, it really cannot be overstated. I mean, if we look at the trajectory of Apple, Steve Jobs was obviously the visionary who gets the original impossible blueprint, right?
The blueprint of the modern smartphone era.
Right. But Tim Cook, he was the ultimate operational architect. He didn't invent the concept of the digital city, but he took that blueprint and built the most profitable, sprawling, inescapable metropolis in the history of global capitalism.
The source material specifically points to his legacy over these last 15 years. It mentions the massive expansion of the services business, the launch of the Vision Pro, and critically, Apple Silicon.
Oh, Apple Silicon is the crown jewel there.
Let's drill into that for a second, because Apple Silicon wasn't just a product update. It was a fundamental re-architecture of how a computer actually operates, bringing the processor, the memory, the neural engine, all onto one proprietary chip, which fundamentally locked down the hardware ecosystem.
Exactly.
It created an impenetrable moat. I mean, Cook's genius was always in supply chain dominance and ecosystem lock-in.
Right, the walled garden.
Exactly. By unifying the architecture with Apple Silicon, he made the hardware so seamlessly integrated and so fundamentally proprietary that leaving the Apple ecosystem became physically and financially painful for the consumer.
You don't just own a phone anymore. Your phone, your watch, your tablet, your laptop, they all breathe the exact same digital air.
Which is exactly what makes the choice of his successor so fascinating here.
John Ternus.
Right, John Ternus. He is fundamentally a hardware engineering specialist. He came up through the ranks, designing the iPad, the AirPods, the Mac transition to Apple Silicon.
So why put a pure hardware guy on the throne of a company that has spent, what, the last decade relentlessly telling Wall Street that its future growth is all about high-margin digital services?
Well, this is the critical pivot point. Bringing in a hardware specialist like Ternus suggests that the existential battle for Apple's next decade isn't going to be fought over selling you a monthly subscription to iCloud.
Or Apple Music.
Right. It signals that Apple recognizes software is about to undergo a radical deflationary transformation.
Deflationary meaning it gets incredibly cheap.
Yes, so their defense mechanism is to just double down on physical hardware supremacy. They need the device itself to be the ultimate irreplaceable choke point of value in a world where software is becoming ubiquitous.
And that transition to the reality of cheap software brings us directly to our next source, item number 7. This perfectly frames that incoming tidal wave.
Oh, the Andreessen quote?
Yeah. We have a quote from Marc Andreessen, the co-founder of the venture capital giant A16s now, and he's proclaiming, and I quote, "I am bullish AI capabilities, so the consumer surplus is going to be insane. The power of God's given away below cost." long the market.
It's a staggering phrase. The power of God's given away below cost.
The source explicitly notes this reflects a growing VC optimism about AI's deflationary potential. But we need to define what Andreessen actually means by consumer surplus in this context.
Sure. So in pure economic terms, consumer surplus is basically the gap between the maximum price a consumer is willing to pay for something and the actual price they end up paying.
So if I'm willing to pay, say, a lawyer $500 to draft a contract, but I get an AI to do it for $50, I have a massive consumer surplus.
Precisely. Now just scale that to infinity.
Mm-hmm.
Andreessen is arguing that AI models have become so extraordinarily capable they can write production-level code, generate high-end marketing copy, perform complex data analysis.
Even create original media.
Right. The functional value they provide to a user is astronomical. But because of this fierce competition between AI labs, the actual price the consumer will pay to access this godlike intelligence is just going to approach zero.
Okay, I have to throw a flag on the play here, though. Let's look at the physical reality of what it takes to run these models.
The compute cost.
Exactly. We're talking about multi-billion-dollar data centers, massive GPU clusters, literal nuclear-level energy consumption.
Yeah, the cooling infrastructure of a small city.
Right. So if this power of God's is truly being given away below cost, is that a permanent, sustainable economic reality? Or are we just watching venture capital firms subsidize an illusion to capture market share?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar tension right there. Is it a permanent deflationary force or just a highly subsidized blitzscaling tactic?
Because it feels like an artifact of zero interest rate era thinking funded by sovereign wealth.
Well, the argument for it being a permanent deflationary force comes down to the marginal cost of reproduction.
Okay, explain that.
Yes, trading the model initially costs billions, but once the model exists, the cost to generate that legal contract or that piece of software drops to fractions of a cent. AI drives the marginal cost of digital production and arguably human cognitive labor towards zero.
Which completely flips the economic model that companies like Apple thrived on over the last 15 years. I mean, Apple thrived by selling you a premium piece of glass and metal so you could access premium, expensive, human-created software.
Exactly. And if the software, the intelligence, and the media operating on the device become practically free, if we truly enter this era of insane consumer surplus, the value of the digital layer just collapses.
Wow. So where does the economic value pool then?
It accrues to the physical hardware, the silicon, a localized compute. And this is exactly why John Ternus is running Apple.
Because if software is free, the only thing you can still sell at a 50% margin is the physical object required to interact with it.
You nailed it.
So the consumer sits in the middle of this. On one hand, you have the legacy giant retreating to fortify its physical walled garden. On the other, Silicon Valley elites are promising that ultimate digital cognitive power will be handed to us for pennies.
It sounds like an absolute utopia for the end user.
It really does. But history shows us that when you democratize a technology that powerful, you don't just hand the power of gods to the creatives and the consumers.
No, you hand it directly to the threat actors, too. The same deflationary forces that make coding a video game cheaper also make writing polymorphic malware cheaper.
And that takes us right over the cliff edge into segment 2, the dark side of this velocity. We are looking at the intersection of AI and fundamental cybersecurity.
This is where it gets scary.
Let's pull up source item number 3. Vercel, which is a massive cloud platform for front-end developers, was just hit by an AI-accelerated supply chain attack.
This incident is exactly where Andreessen's theoretical consumer surplus violently collides with the grim reality of the digital frontline. The barrier to entry for complex cybercrime literally just dropped to zero.
Let's lay out the mechanics of this attack based on the source, because the details really matter here. This was a supply chain attack. It didn't originate inside Vercel.
Right. It traced back to a compromised device belonging to an employee at a completely different company.
A third-party vendor called Context AI. And the attacker infected the specific device with a piece of malware known as LumaStealer.
And LumaStealer is critical to understand here. It's an information stealer, often sold on dark web forums as malware as a service.
Like a subscription model for hackers.
Exactly. It's designed to silently scrape browsers, cryptocurrency wallets, and session data. It doesn't break systems, it steals the keys that have already been validated.
And in this case, the keys they stole were OAuth tokens. So for the listener, what exactly is an OAuth token in this context?
Think of an oath token as a digital VIP wristband. When you log into a service, say using your Google or GitHub account, instead of handing your actual password to the third-party app, the authentication server issues a token.
Okay.
It tells the system, hey, this user's already proven who they are. Let them access these specific resources for the next 30 days without asking for credentials again.
So the attacker lifts the VIP wristband off the Context AI employee's device, walks up to the club door, and the bouncer just lets them right in.
They are completely authenticated. They bypass multi-factor authentication entirely because the session is already considered trusted.
Wow.
But here is where the attack paradigm completely fractures. Let's look at the statement from Vercel's CEO.
Right. The CEO stated that the attacker moved with surprising velocity and explicitly noted that the attack was significantly accelerated by AI.
Yeah.
They managed to expose non-sensitive environment variables before Vercel finally engaged Mandiant and law enforcement.
That phrase, significantly accelerated by AI, in an official corporate incident report, is a watershed moment for the industry.
Why is it so unprecedented?
Because traditionally, once a human hacker grabs that oath token and breaches a network, they face a massive cognitive bottleneck. They have to manually map the environment.
Like trying to find their way around a dark building.
Exactly. They have to figure out what permissions they actually hold, where the valuable databases are stored, and what the internal architecture looks like. We call this dwell time, and it usually takes days or even weeks.
Right. It's a guy in a hoodie manually typing directory commands, sweating, trying not to trip any internal alarms.
But the Vercel attack indicates that the dwell time is shrinking to milliseconds. When the attacker used AI, they weren't manually exploring. The AI ingested the environment variables instantly.
And environment variables are essentially the configuration settings, right?
Yes, they contain the roadmaps, the internal IP addresses, the API keys, the entire architectural layout of the cloud deployment.
So the AI essentially reads the entire blueprint of the building the second it walks through the front door.
And it instantly calculates the optimal path for privilege escalation or data exfiltration. It scripts the lateral movement on the fly. It moves with a machine speed velocity that human security operations centers simply cannot match.
It is the power of gods, just like Andreessen said, but applied to digital destruction.
Exactly.
And if you think the defenders are struggling with lateral movement inside the network, wait until you see how they're handling the front door. This brings us to source item number 12.
Yeah, this one is rough.
It is an absolutely dire update from CISA, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
And just for context for you listening, when CISA updates their KV, the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, it is not an academic exercise.
No, it's not a drill.
This is the federal government's red alert list. If a bug is on the KV, it means threat actors are actively weaponizing it in the wild to compromise systems right now.
The source notes CISA just added 8 new actively exploited vulnerabilities to the catalog. We are talking about critical flaws in major enterprise software. Cisco SD-WAN, Papercut, TeamCity, Kentico, Zimbra.
Big names?
Massive. But the absolute standout is a vulnerability in Quest KCE, which has been assigned a CVSS score of 10.8.
We really need to explain the sheer terror of a CVSS 10.0. The Common Vulnerability Scoring System is the industry standard for assessing the severity of a flaw.
And 10.0 is the max.
A 10.0 is the absolute theoretical maximum. It is the worst-case scenario mathematically possible.
So what does a 10 out of 10 actually look like in practice? Like, does the server just voluntarily email its own hard drive to the hacker?
I mean, it practically does. A 10.0 usually hits all the worst metrics. Attack vector. Network, meaning it can be exploited remotely over the open internet.
Okay.
Attack complexity. Low, meaning a relatively unskilled attacker can execute it reliably. Privileges required. None, meaning the attacker doesn't even need a basic user account.
Wow, so no login required.
Exactly. User interaction. None, meaning nobody inside the targeted company has to click a bad link or download a phishing file.
So how does it happen?
The attacker just sends a specific malformed packet of data to an exposed server, and they instantly achieve arbitrary remote code execution. They completely own the machine.
And here's where the timeline completely breaks down. CISA has mandated that federal agencies patch the Cisco SD-WAN vulnerabilities by April 23, and the rest, including that 10.0 flaw, by May 4.
Right.
Remember, our current date is April 21. CISA is telling federal agencies they have a 48-hour window to patch critical enterprise networking infrastructure.
That is the sound of the traditional cybersecurity model collapsing under its own weight.
Let's challenge this reality for a second. Federal networks and massive Fortune 500 corporations are monolithic. They are these Byzantine labyrinths of legacy code and custom integrations.
Oh, totally.
The standard IT policy for deploying a patch involves a staging server, weeks of regression testing to make sure the patch doesn't accidentally brick a mission-critical database, and a scheduled weekend maintenance window.
Right. The change advisory board has to approve it.
Exactly. So how on earth do you compress a 6-week testing cycle into 48 hours without accidentally taking your own company offline?
You don't.
Yeah.
You are forced to play an unwinnable game of Russian roulette. You either deploy the patch completely untested and pray it doesn't cause a catastrophic outage, or you leave the vulnerability open and basically guarantee a breach.
It's a nightmare scenario.
The entire concept of patch management relies on this assumption that you have a grace period between when a vulnerability is disclosed and when attackers figure out how to reliably exploit it at scale.
But the Vercel incident we just talked about proved that AI has evaporated that grace period.
Precisely. Because if AI can ingest environment variables to move laterally in seconds, it can also ingest a newly released patch file, reverse engineer the vulnerability it's designed to fix, and generate a working exploit payload in hours.
Wow.
The speed of modern AI-assisted exploitation has fundamentally outpaced human bureaucratic patching timelines. We are fighting a machine-speed chemical fire with a bureaucratic bucket brigade.
It's an absolutely terrifying paradigm. But as fast as AI is, it still relies on the fundamental rules of mathematics working correctly underneath it all.
Right, the cryptography.
So what happens if the actual math holding the digital world together stops functioning?
Well, then you aren't talking about velocity anymore. You're talking about an existential structural collapse. You're talking about quantum.
Let's transition into segment 3, the quantum ticking clock in Web 3. We are moving from the sheer speed of AI to a threat that attacks the very foundation of the cryptographic web.
This is a heavy one.
Let's look at source item number 6. Sonic Labs has issued a stark warning regarding the structural integrity of the blockchain ecosystem. They are stating that most proof-of-stake, or POS chains, are fundamentally structurally vulnerable to quantum computing.
And to be clear, this isn't just a hypothetical academic paper. This is a diagnosis of a terminal architectural flaw in hundreds of billions of dollars worth of decentralized infrastructure.
The source specifically points to a mechanism called BLS aggregation. Sonic Labs warns that because these networks rely so heavily on BLS aggregation, migrating to post-quantum cryptography isn't a matter of just swapping out some digital keys. It requires a full protocol redesign.
Let's unpack the cryptography here so you can understand exactly why this is such a nightmare. Most modern blockchains, like Ethereum, have moved to proof-of-stake consensus.
Right, moving away from mining.
Exactly. Instead of burning electricity to mine blocks, thousands of validators put up capital, their stake, and they all have to digitally sign off on the state of the network to confirm transactions.
Okay, so you have tens of thousands of validators who all need to cast a vote essentially every few seconds.
Right. Now, if you take tens of thousands of individual digital signatures and record every single one of them on the blockchain block after block, the network bloats instantly.
It would be too massive to store.
Right. The data storage requirements would become so massive that only supercomputers could run a node, which completely destroys the whole concept of decentralization.
So they needed a way to compress the data.
And the solution they found was BLS aggregation. BLS stands for Bona, Lin, and Shakeups, the cryptographers who developed the scheme. It uses a branch of mathematics called pairing-based cryptography on elliptic curves.
Okay, without getting lost in the algebra here.
I'll keep it high level. BLS basically allows you to take tens of thousands of individual signatures from different validators and mathematically compress them into one single tiny master signature.
Think of it like a massive petition. Instead of carrying around a wheelbarrow full of 10,000 signed pages to prove everyone agreed, BLS is like a magical piece of paper where all 10,000 signatures perfectly overlap.
I like that.
It creates one single verifiable signature that proves every single person signed, but it only takes up the space of one name.
That analogy is spot on. It's an elegant, brilliant piece of mathematical engineering that allows these networks to scale. But it contains a fatal flaw in the face of quantum computing.
The math breaks.
Yes. The elliptic curve mathematics that make that magical compression possible rely on what's called the discrete logarithm problem. A classical computer would take millions of years to guess the underlying keys from that aggregated signature. But a sufficiently powerful quantum computer running Shor's algorithm can solve it almost instantly.
And once it solves it, the quantum attacker can just forge the master signature.
Exactly. They can theoretically rewrite the history of the blockchain to prove invalid transactions or just drain the network completely.
Which brings us to the core of Sonic Labs' terrifying warning. Because BLS aggregation is baked into the deepest layer of how these networks reach consensus, you can't just release a quick software patch.
No. If your house has a broken lock, you call a locksmith. But BLS isn't the lock on the door. It is the chemical composition of the concrete foundation of the house.
Right.
A quantum computer doesn't pick the lock. It alters the physics so the concrete just dissolves.
So to fix that, you have to physically lift the entire house into the air, pour a completely new foundation, utilizing quantum-safe lattice-based cryptography, and then delicately set the house back down.
Exactly. And you have to do all of that while the house is currently occupied by millions of users transacting billions of dollars. That is what a full protocol redesign actually means.
It's a monumental, high-risk engineering challenge. It could split networks or cause catastrophic downtime.
Which perfectly frames our next source, because someone
Yeah.
is actually trying to engineer that exact foundation lift right now.
Let's look at source item number 1. Ripple has just announced a comprehensive 4-phase roadmap to make the XRP Ledger quantum resistant, and they've set a hard target. They plan to complete this by 2028.
If Sonic Labs delivered the grim MRI results, Ripple is scrubbing in for the open heart surgery. Setting a 2028 deadline is an aggressive timeline that speaks volumes about the perceived proximity of the threat.
The source notes a really critical detail about this roadmap. Phase 4 includes an emergency protocol they are calling Q-Day readiness.
Yeah, Q-Day.
This phase outlines a mechanism to force a migration to quantum-safe accounts if the quantum threat arrives sooner than their timeline anticipates.
Q-Day is the apocalyptic shorthand in the cryptography world. It's the hypothetical specific day when a nation-state or a private lab brings online a cryptographically relevant quantum computer.
One capable of breaking the RSA and elliptic curve standards.
Right, the standards that secure not just crypto, but the entire global financial system, military communications, and all secure web traffic.
For years, Q-Day was dismissed as a problem for 2035 or maybe 2040, like something for the next generation of engineers to worry about. But Ripple building an emergency ripcord into a 2028 roadmap suggests the intelligence on quantum advancements is seriously spooking the industry.
They are absolutely building a panic button. But let's critically examine the concept of a forced migration on a decentralized ledger, because it creates a massive governance paradox.
How so?
Well, the core tenet of Web3 is that you possess your private keys, and no central authority can touch your assets or force you to act.
Right. So how does a decentralized network force a user to migrate to a new cryptographic standard?
It requires a brutal system-wide hard fork. The network validators have to reach consensus to essentially rewrite the fundamental rules of the ledger. They would have to implement logic that says, as of block height X, any wallet utilizing the old quantum-vulnerable elliptic curve signatures will be permanently deprecated.
If you want to move your funds, you must transition to a new wallet utilizing the new quantum-safe scheme before that block. But wait, what if I'm a long-term holder? Say I bought some XRP years ago, put the keys on a hardware wallet, locked it in a safety deposit box, and I just haven't checked the news.
Which happens all the time.
Right. I don't hear about the migration. Q-Day happens, the block height passes, and my old signature scheme is deprecated. What happens to my money?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question that the industry hasn't entirely solved yet. Depending on how the protocol redesign is implemented, your funds could be permanently frozen because the network literally will not process the old math anymore.
Oh, wow.
Or worse, if the public key of your wallet is known to the network, a quantum attacker could derive your private key and drain your vault before you even realize Q-Day happened. A forced migration requires a level of global coordination and communication that decentralized systems have historically been terrible at executing.
It's an incredible irony, isn't it? We're talking about Web3, an ecosystem born from the cypherpunk ethos of absolute immutability, decentralization, and code is law. But when faced with an existential threat like Q-Day, or honestly even just a massive old-fashioned exploit, these networks are forced to behave in ways that require intense, centralized coordination. They scramble, they hit emergency stops, and they act remarkably like the traditional financial systems they were built to replace.
Which serves as the perfect conceptual bridge into segment 4, the maturing of Web3, intervention, and regulation.
Let's pull up source item number 2 because it illustrates this exact philosophical tension in real time. We are looking at Arbitrum, which is one of the largest layer 2 networks scaling Ethereum.
Right.
There was a major exploit involving a decentralized finance project called KelpDAO. In response, Arbitrum rapidly froze 30,766 ETH that was linked to the attacker. That is worth tens of millions of dollars.
The source notes that this freeze demonstrates the growing capability of Layer 2 networks to intervene in security incidents.
I have to challenge the core premise of what is happening here, though. For years, the rallying cry of crypto was censorship resistance. The idea that nobody, not a bank manager, not a government, and certainly not a network operator, could freeze your funds.
The whole point was being trustless.
Right. Doesn't Arbitrum, a decentralized layer 2, stepping in and freezing 30,000 ETH, completely nuke the foundational code is law philosophy? How do they even possess the technical capability to hit a freeze button?
It creates an intense philosophical fracture, no doubt about it. But you have to look at the mechanical architecture of a Layer 2 network to understand how they achieved it. Layer 1, the base Ethereum blockchain, is designed to be maximally decentralized and immutable.
Right.
To freeze funds on Layer 1 requires a massive social consensus to rewrite the chain history, which famously happened after the DAO hack in 2016, but is practically impossible today.
Layer 1 is the immutable bedrock.
But Layer 2 networks like Arbitrum operate differently. They're essentially high-speed execution environments built on top of Layer 1. They process thousands of transactions cheaply, bundle them up, and post the cryptographic proofs back to Ethereum.
Okay.
To manage this complex bridging of assets, Layer 2s heavily utilize smart contracts. And crucially, many of these core contracts are upgradable.
Upgradable contracts. That sounds like a backdoor.
In a way, it is a managed backdoor. They often utilize what's called a proxy contract pattern. The logic of how the network handles funds can be altered by a governing body, often a decentralized DAO, or in emergency situations, a multi-sig wallet controlled by a security council.
So there's an emergency override.
Yes. If a massive exploit happens and the hacker tries to move the stolen funds across the Arbitrum bridge back to Layer 1, that security council can theoretically intervene. They can upgrade the contract or execute emergency protocols to blacklist the attacker's address, trapping the funds in the Layer 2.
So they effectively act as a decentralized board of directors with cryptographic veto power over the network traffic.
Exactly. And this is the painful maturation process of Web3. On a philosophical level, yes, it heavily dilutes the purity of code is law. It introduces human subjectivity and intervention.
Which purists hate.
But on a pragmatic level, when you are scaling infrastructure to handle institutional Wall Street level capital, the tolerance for irreversible catastrophic loss drops to zero. A pension fund isn't going to put money on a network where a single line of bad code can evaporate $1 billion with no recourse.
By building in these circuit breakers, networks like Arbitrum are weighing a philosophical absolute against the practical reality of consumer protection.
They are acting like the adults in the room when the alarm bells ring.
And it seems that adult behavior is finally generating a reciprocal response from the U.S. government. Let's look at source item number 4, which details a monumental shift in regulatory posture.
We need to analyze this strictly from a structural and market impact perspective, keeping the politics entirely neutral because the implications for the technology are massive.
Agreed. The source outlines recent statements by SEC Chair Paul Atkins. He explicitly stated his mission is to advance, clarify, and transform crypto regulation.
Transform is a strong word there.
Speaking to CNBC, he signaled a hard pivot away from the agency's previous enforcement-first approach, aiming instead to embrace innovation. The source highlights this as a significant foundational shift in how the U.S. views digital assets.
To understand the impact of this pivot, you really have to understand the chilling effect of the previous paradigm. For years, the primary interface between the SEC and the crypto industry was litigation.
The Howey test.
Right. The SEC utilized the Howey test, a legal framework from the 1940s involving orange groves, to determine if digital assets were securities. But they rarely provided proactive guidelines on how a decentralized network could actually comply with those 1940s rules.
It was heavily criticized by the industry as regulation by enforcement. You only find out you were speeding after you've been pulled over, hauled into court, and handed a $100 million fine.
And that environment forces companies into a defensive crouch. When your regulatory environment is purely combative, a massive percentage of your venture capital, your engineering time, and your executive bandwidth is consumed by legal defense. Now, connect this back to everything we've talked about today.
Right. Ripple is trying to execute a complex 4-phase quantum migration. Arbitrum is trying to safely govern multi-sig emergency freezes.
Precisely. These are existential engineering challenges. If Chair Atkins follows through on advance, clarify, and transform, it replaces retroactive punishment with proactive framing. It provides regulatory breathing room.
They can actually plan for the future.
If developers know the actual boundaries of the sandbox, if they know what constitutes a utility token versus a security, or what the liability is for a Layer 2 Security Council freezing funds, they can stop paying lawyers and start paying cryptographers. A pivot to clarification provides the stability required to harden the infrastructure against things like Q-Day and AI-accelerated exploits.
It's the maturation of the entire stack, from the mathematical layer to the governance layer to the federal regulatory layer. But ultimately, all of this high finance, Web3 infrastructure, all of these policy debates have to land in the real world.
They have to intersect with daily life.
Exactly. And that takes us into segment 5, real-world impacts, emerging markets, and consumer ecosystems.
We're moving from the theoretical macro structure down to the ground-level reality of financial integration. Let's look at source item number 11.
This is a critical update out of Nigeria. The Nigerian Communications Commission, the NCC, and the Central Bank of Nigeria, the CBN, have forged a new interagency partnership.
This is a really big deal.
They are specifically targeting telecom-linked fraud and financial risks. The source notes their goal is to close the regulatory and technical gaps in mobile money and digital payments that cybercriminals constantly exploit.
This is a fascinating architectural blueprint for how you secure mobile money globally. I mean, we just spent 20 minutes talking about highly sophisticated AI-driven supply chain hacks and quantum computers breaking elliptic curves.
Right.
But in many emerging markets, the most devastating financial fraud doesn't involve breaking cryptography at all.
Mm-hmm.
It involves exploiting the administrative gap between the phone in your pocket and the bank ledger.
Walk us through that gap. Why is a partnership between a telecom regulator and a banking regulator the key to stopping this?
Because of how mobile money functions fundamentally. In Nigeria and across much of the African continent, mobile money platforms and USSD codes are the absolute lifeline of the economy.
Mm.
They allow millions of unbanked or underbanked individuals to trade, pay bills, and survive using nothing more than a basic feature phone and a phone number.
But the infrastructure is fundamentally bifurcated.
Right. It's split between two different masters.
Yes. The telecom company controls the physical SIM card, the cellular network, and the phone number itself. But the financial institution, or the mobile money operator, controls the actual digital ledger where the money sits.
So the telecom manages the identity, and the bank manages the money.
And the fraudster lives in the shadow between them.
Exactly. The most common vector is a SIM swap attack. A fraudster uses social engineering, or maybe bribes a low-level telecom employee, to transfer your phone number to a new SIM card in the fraudster's possession.
Okay.
The moment that happens, the fraudster assumes your digital identity. They trigger a password reset on your mobile money account. The bank's automated system sends an SMS verification code, but the code goes to the fraudster's phone because they now control the number.
And the bank has absolutely no idea the SIM was swapped because they only see a valid request from the verified phone number, and the telecom company doesn't care about the money because they just manage the routing of SMS messages.
That siloed architecture is the vulnerability. If the regulators don't talk, the systems don't talk. By partnering, the NCC and the CBN are attempting to fuse that architecture.
How does that actually look in practice?
They can mandate real-time API integrations. If a SIM card is swapped at the telecom level, the telecom can instantly push a flag to the central bank's clearing network, immediately freezing all outbound mobile money transfers from that specific phone number for 48 hours.
Oh, wow. Closing that interagency communication gap is how you protect a citizen's livelihood from disappearing in 10 minutes.
It really is. It's a powerful reminder that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is deeply intertwined with systemic human and institutional realities.
And that brings us perfectly to source item number 8, which highlights the painful friction when technology collides with physical economic constraints.
This is a sobering reality check on the limits of digital innovation.
The source notes that a viral post by a marketer named Toby Odukoya has reignited a massive, ongoing conversation in Nigeria regarding the cost of healthcare. It spotlights the growing intersection of tech-enabled health solutions and the systemic affordability challenges faced across the continent.
We spend so much time marveling at the potential of AI to optimize our lives, but this story forces us to draw a hard line between digital optimization and physical reality.
Let's debate this for a second. Tech companies constantly pitch the narrative that software will solve healthcare. They build telemedicine platforms, AI diagnostic tools to read X-rays, hyper-efficient routing apps to get medicine delivered. Why doesn't that solve the affordability crisis Toby Odukoya's post highlights?
Because software is fundamentally an optimizer, not a manufacturer of physical goods.
Yep.
You can have the most beautifully designed, hyper-efficient Layer 2 blockchain routing a payment and an AI instantly scheduling a doctor's appointment based on traffic patterns.
Right.
But the tech hits a brick wall the moment it encounters the physical economic base.
It doesn't change the molecular reality?
It cannot alter the physics of the economy. An app cannot lower the import tariffs on the physical chemical reagents required to run a blood test. An AI cannot unilaterally lower the systemic inflation that destroys a patient's purchasing power.
That's a great point.
A digital platform cannot generate the physical electricity required to keep a hospital's ventilators running during a grid failure. Nor can it fundamentally alter the macroeconomic incentives required to stop doctors from emigrating to higher-paying countries.
The digital overlay is flawless, but the physical foundation is fractured.
Exactly. The viral nature of the debate shows that consumers are acutely aware of this limitation. Tech can democratize access to medical advice, it can optimize the supply chain of drugs, but it cannot cure systemic economic poverty. When the digital utopia collides with physical inflation and supply constraints, the physical world always wins.
And speaking of the physical world, the objects we actually hold in our hands, let's bring this entire deep dive full circle. Let's look at our final two consumer tech updates, source items 9 and 10. From the lofty heights of Andreessen's AI gods and Sonic Labs' quantum threats, we return to the hardware ecosystem.
The physical anchors of our digital lives.
Verizon is currently running a massive, aggressive promotion. They are offering a free iPad or a free Apple Watch when customers purchase a new iPhone.
Classic bundle.
The source notes this reflects intensifying carrier competition and a massive push to lock users into multi-device ecosystems. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the audio spectrum, Sennheiser has just launched the HD 480 Pro. These are high-end, closed-back studio headphones explicitly designed for audio professionals where absolute sound isolation is critical.
It is incredibly telling how these two hardware stories represent the extreme, polarizing poles of the modern consumer experience we've charted today.
Let's look at Verizon first. Connect this directly back to segment 1, to Tim Cook stepping down and John Ternus taking over Apple.
The Verizon promotion is the ultimate manifestation of Cook's walled garden, weaponized by the carrier. Telecoms like Verizon have realized that the era of simply selling you a bucket of data is over.
Data is just a commodity now.
Right, it's a commodity. To survive, they need to lock you in. They are desperate to be the pipeline that tethers you to the exact integrated hardware ecosystem that Tim Cook spent 15 years meticulously building.
So by subsidizing the iPad or the watch, they aren't just giving you a gift, they are heavily weighing you down.
They are drastically increasing the friction of churn. If you just have an iPhone, switching to a different carrier or a different phone brand is a minor headache. But if your phone, your watch, your tablet, and your cellular plan are all financially and technically intertwined in a 36-month bill credit contract,
Leaving that ecosystem becomes an insurmountable logistical nightmare.
they're using the physical hardware as an anchor to secure long-term recurring service revenue. The hardware is the trap.
It's the physical manifestation of ecosystem lock-in.
Mm.
And then, completely contrasting that interconnected noise, you have Sennheiser.
Think about the philosophy behind the HD 480 Pro. We started this hour dissecting Marc Andreessen's vision of an insane AI consumer surplus, a near future overflowing with infinite, cheaply generated digital content. Millions of AI models churning out software, music, text, and synthetic media at machine speed.
A world of absolute, overwhelming digital saturation.
And in response to that infinite surplus of digital noise, what is Sennheiser's value proposition? They are selling highly specialized, precision-engineered physical hardware whose primary feature is absolute physical isolation.
Closed-back acoustic seals.
Designed to block out the cacophony of the world so a professional can focus on a single intentional frequency. It is the exact antithesis of the AI surplus.
In a world where AI makes generating noise free, Sennheiser is betting that human focus and physical silence will become the ultimate premium product.
Exactly. The hardware provides the sanctuary that the software destroyed.
Wow, we have truly run the gamut today, navigating the absolute edge of technological velocity. Let's take a breath and recap the sheer scale of the journey we've been on during this deep dive for you.
It's been a ride.
We started with the monumental end of an era, watching Tim Cook hand the operational keys of the world's most profitable hardware ecosystem over to John Ternus. We debated the profound economic reality of Marc Andreessen's vision, questioning if AI giving us the power of gods below cost is a permanent deflationary force or a temporary illusion that will commoditize software and make hardware our only defense.
We stared into the terrifying void of that deflationary power with the Vercel attack, watching AI ingest environment variables to move at machine speed, completely shattering the traditional human dwell time. We saw CISA desperately mandating 48-hour patches for CVSS 10.0 vulnerabilities, proving that our bureaucratic defense timelines are fundamentally broken.
We confronted the existential mathematics of the quantum ticking clock, analyzing how BLS aggregation threatens the very foundation of proof-of-stake blockchains, while Ripple frantically engineers a forced migration ripcord for Q-Day.
We watched the Web3 ecosystem wrestle with its own maturation, as Arbitrum leverages proxy contracts to freeze millions in stolen ETH, challenging the ethos of code is law, right as SEC Chair Paul Atkins pivots federal policy from retroactive punishment to proactive clarification, giving the industry the breathing room it needs to survive.
And finally, we grounded the digital abstract in the physical reality. We saw the NCC and CBN partnering to close the dangerous gap between telecom identity and bank ledgers in Nigeria. We confronted the hard truth that tech cannot cure systemic inflation in healthcare, and we ended with the hardware itself, Verizon, locking us into Cook's ecosystem, while Sennheiser tries to sell us a desperately needed moment of isolated silence. You are now armed with the comprehensive technical and structural insights to navigate this incredibly complex landscape.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, unresolved paradox to mull over. We began by analyzing Marc Andreessen's claim that AI will make the power of gods virtually free, creating a massive deflationary consumer surplus of intelligence. But look at the sheer scale of the defenses we've discussed today.
Right.
Re-architecting blockchain foundations for quantum resistance, developing AI speed countermeasures to fight machine speed exploits, fusing national telecom and banking infrastructure. The structural defense of the internet is going to require trillions of dollars of capital expenditure and unprecedented human coordination. Here's the thought I want you to carry with you. What happens to society when the world's intelligence becomes incredibly cheap and infinitely abundant, but the cost to mathematically, physically, and structurally secure that intelligence becomes astronomically expensive?
Wow.
Will true security, the guarantee that your data, your money, and your identity haven't been compromised, become the ultimate unaffordable luxury good in a deflationary AI world?
A world where everything is free but nothing is safe. Now that is a structural paradox that will keep you up at night. Thank you for joining us on this incredible, expansive journey. Keep questioning the foundation, keep looking for the signal in the overwhelming noise, and we will see you on the next deep dive.